All right, we're going to go ahead and get started on the second part of this conversation. We began by focusing on governance and the 4 rooms, and now we're going to talk about how do you use some of those ideas that we talked about earlier to get into a really challenging topic in family businesses, which is managing leadership transitions and just that succession process more broadly. Why is transition planning so difficult? Well, it gets us into some really sensitive areas. You know, I oftentimes, in talking to families about this, I'll say, I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm about to kill all of you off. At least not in reality, but just as a way of understanding what might happen. And these conversations can be very challenging. They bring up lots of emotion. We're talking about not only about money, but about legacy and about value and about all the kind of stuff that really is at the heart of what both makes family businesses special and different, but also what creates the seeds of some of their collapse. So what I want to do is really talk about how the 4-room model can help us in planning for leadership transitions. And I thought it might be useful to pick a few topics in particular. So first, we'll talk about fairness issues. So as I promised we would. Then we'll talk about sort of this idea of how do you actually open up multiple avenues for leadership. Oftentimes when we talk about succession, we're using, if anyone's seen The Lion King, we call the Simba model, right? Which is my succession planning is done because I hold up the next generation and here they are and they'll rule over everything. Not to spoil The Lion King, it doesn't work out quite like that. And then we oftentimes get into this sort of like all or nothing approach to succession, and we can actually use the 4 rooms to take a different view and think about how do we actually manage that process effectively. Okay, so we'll start by talking about fairness issues. These are some, quotes or things I've heard over the years. Some of you may have experienced or said or heard things like this. But fairness issues are all over in family businesses. Like I'm the one growing the business. Why do my siblings get the same amount of money as me? Or on the flip side, why does that person get paid more than a non-family member who'd be working for the company? Or why do my cousins own more than me just because my parents had more children, right? If we're dividing the shares up by number. So all these things happen all the time. And one of the things I think is important to understand that is behind a lot of these fairness issues is that we don't actually judge. You'd think that these problems would go away the more money you make, there's enough for everybody. It turns out they often just get worse because there's more to fight over. And the reason is because as humans, we actually don't judge how much we have on a absolute basis, have more than I did last year. We judge it on a relative basis, right? How much do I have compared to someone else, and especially on a relative basis. How much do I have relative to how much my relatives have? So let me ask you to think through a thought experiment. I'm actually not going to make you answer this question because I always get different answers when I do this with people raising their hands versus answering anonymously. The people, when they answer anonymously, are more honest. But I want you to imagine that you and a sibling, if you have more than one sibling, you can pick one. If you don't have one, you can make one up. I know one of you has twins, so that's probably an easy choice. Imagine that you and a sibling are receiving a year-end bonus from your family business. Okay, and here's 2 options that you're going to have. Option A is that you get $10,000, your sibling receives $5,000. Option B is that you get 15, but your sibling gets 30. And just think for a minute what your emotional reaction would be. Which one of those would you really choose? There's an interesting book that came out a while. This is an older book. It's called Born to Rebel, and it's about birth order, family dynamics, and creative lives. And what's interesting about this book is that it wasn't written by a psychologist. It was actually written by a historian of science. And he set out to answer the question, when big ideas come along, whether it's, the Earth revolving around the sun as opposed to vice versa, or Darwinism, why do some people accept these new scientific advances and other people don't? And he looked at all these possible explanations, and what he came back with was birth order. That the eldest people in a family they tend to benefit more from the status quo. They're there first, they're biggest, they're stronger. They're first in line for all the stuff. And so the existing environment works well for them. They don't want to change it because it benefits them, right? Those that are coming along later, they need to find something else. They need to be more open to other things because all the other spots are already taken. And so his argument in part was not only is Darwin, Charles Darwin was not only the youngest, but he was like the youngest of a youngest of a youngest of a youngest. And I don't want to go too far with that idea, whether you believe it or not. I think the birth order stuff is interesting. It tells us something. But what was interesting about this to me is that it really spoke to, and what the author talked about, is how much competition is really embedded inside of our families. And one of the things he said was that siblings tend to disagree about how to allocate shared resources. Parents normally encourage equal sharing, but offspring prefer to acquire more, right? And their idea of fairness is to give a sibling only 1/3 of any shared item, which is about what Charlie was willing to give Eloise in this case. And this kind of gets to this idea of, those of you that are parents or, all of us were kids at some point, how sensitive we are to favoritism, right? We all try super hard as parents, I certainly do, to try to make things seem as equal as possible. And the children are equally sensitive to anything that's not perceived as equal. And what he makes the argument is that this is not just an accident, this is actually Darwinism at work, in a sense, because we are, at some level, competing, whether it's for food in families where there's a shortage of that, but we're competing for love and attention and all those other things. Well, why is this important? Because it gets to the heart of why issues of fairness and equality are so challenging in a family business, right? And so one dynamic that's happening inside of families is that above a certain basic level of resources, there's, in the U.S., the analysis has been done, it's probably like $70,000 to $80,000 of income, something like that. Of anything above that, we care a lot more about what we have relative to someone else rather than how much we have absolutely. The technical, the research on this says the inequality associated with relative advantage is so appealing that it overrides both a desire for fairness and a desire for absolute gains. Or, to put it more directly, every time a friend succeeds, I die a little. Right? So there is something in our families, and I think this is, as I said, especially true in families, is that we're paying attention to how we're doing relative to others. And then, in reality, it's not just about equality. You'd say, well, okay, the simple answer there is let's just make everyone equal. Well, that has its own problems. And one of them is that people actually care a lot more about fairness than they do equality itself. And that sometimes what is perceived as equal is actually seen as unfair. So it actually doesn't solve the problem at all. So one of the biggest challenges in a family business is just navigating this reality and really getting to this question of when is equal fair and when is unequal fair. And as you're getting into this, you can kind of think about a spectrum. And on one side of that spectrum is a family that's really focusing on the inheritance aspect of it, the birthright. That's the most important thing. It defines everything in the family. On the other end of the spectrum, you get to families that think about contribution. It's based on merit, right? That's the only thing that matters. And what's the reality of family business is that you need some of both. When you get the extreme of the inherit model, then people start to have, the entitlement attitude. The world is my oyster, not your oyster kind of thing. It creates a disincentive to work if everything is based on inheritance. It tends to really affect a company's culture in a negative way when people walk in saying, I'm the owner, so you should listen to me. And as I mentioned earlier, ownership is a really powerful thing. It's I think it's the most important, least discussed idea in the field of business because ownership brings with it the right to do stuff. But it's a very blunt instrument, right? If you try to wield it too much, then it gets into these really difficult conversations. And I've seen this with families where they say, I am the single most important shareholder here because, I'm an only child and my cousins divided it by 4. So I'm the one who has all the power. All of you need to listen to me. So that can be really corrosive to relationships. On the other extreme, we tend to talk about the opposite of nepotism, the inherit model, which is the merit model. What's interesting there is that can create its own entitlement attitude, because you can sort of not realize that if you're a second, third, whatever generation coming into it, you actually had some advantages that no one else did. It wasn't purely your own merit that got you to where you are. One of the family business leaders I know, second generation, really neat guy. He says, I know I was born on third base, so I'm going to steal home. It's a recognition that both I've had these advantages, but I'm going to do something with it. But also they can create this idea of if everything is about merit, you have to work for what you get. It can create this idea of golden handcuffs in a family business, where if in order to benefit from the company, you have to work there. Then if the company is valuable and the jobs are good, then everyone's going to want to work there, whether they should be working there or not. Also, if we focus too much on merit, we tend to ignore another aspect of family businesses, which is that when we think about the long-term perspective and not having to worry about quarterly earnings and all the good things we talk about with family businesses, part of that's because you are willing to keep your capital in the company for the long term. And that's not just those that are working in the business, but if you have non-active shareholders, they're willing to keep their capital in the business too. And if they're not, then instead of using your money to grow, you have to use your money to buy them out. And then lastly, if we sort of focus too much on merit and earning, then what happens is we get the horse race dynamics. And you can see some of how that plays out, whether it's at the real world of the Murdoch family or the fictional world of Succession, where they're actually playing off against each other. So neither extreme really works, right? It can't just be all about the inheritance is what rules the day, but also merit in the extreme doesn't work so well either. And so the work is in part figuring out where are we in the middle? How do we differentiate between what is compensation for work done, which should be done at some comparison of market rates, versus something that actually comes from inheritance, which is that there should be a benefit that comes from being an owner, whether you're working in the business or not. So how do you do that? Well, practically what you can do is to start to spell out, using the 4 rooms, how do you start to think about how money works in your family business to balance what is you get because you were born into the family versus what do you get from what you've earned from your own hard work and contribution. In the early stages of most family businesses, there's no distinction between those things. We don't differentiate between what's compensation for work done versus what is a dividend. We just kind of pay out money, and we don't really know exactly where it's coming from. And that's fine if you have, as I've seen, a group of siblings who are all doing basically the same job. They all take out the same amount of money. Okay, not a problem. But what about that next generation where some are in, some are out? One's a CEO, the other is at a mid-level role. It doesn't work so well anymore. So thinking about each of the rooms has a different standard of fairness. It has different forms of compensation and a different benchmark or different way of understanding and deciding what kind of compensation is fair. So in the management room, we're really focusing here on performance and value add to the company. And whether it's salary and bonus or profit sharing, we're usually wanting to look at some version of market rate, right? Maybe it's a little higher to encourage people to come in. Maybe it's a little lower than market rate in order to discourage people from just getting a job at the family business because they couldn't get a job somewhere else. But it's usually related to that. When we get into if you have a board of directors, then it's really about what's your contribution. Are you a member? Are you a leader? Are you not part of it? And you give people fees for participation or for being the chair or running a committee. And you can benchmark against other companies of similar size. When you get to the ownership role, well, that fundamentally is about percentage of shares. If someone happens to have 50% and someone has 20%, then that person with 50%, what's fair is to get more. Ownership is the right to the residual. After you've paid all your bills and made all your reinvestments, ownership is what's left over. That is what is ultimately fair. And then if you have family rooms, sometimes you'll have sort of like a family council, someone chairs it or runs it, you'll have some compensation there, not as typical. But that, again, is going to be based upon participation. So what I encourage you to do, this is a really fraught area, very complicated. There's not a simple answer to say, you should either just get what you earned, or we should all get the same because we came from the same family. Use the 4 rooms and the different roles within it to sort of pick apart the money and say what's coming for what role. On what basis is someone doing that? And then it can help to take something that it can be a thorny issue and to make it more addressable. Okay? So that's a way to use the 4 rooms to help address some of the challenges of fairness in a family business. The second one I want to talk about is leadership. And, the idea of there being, different kinds of roles, and again, using the 4 rooms as a way to understand what those roles are and the importance of having multiple contributions, not just being in kind of the Simba model of we have a CEO and therefore we're done with succession planning. So again, I'll give you a few real life kind of quotes. He has no business experience. Why do we have the same say over decisions? I'm sure everyone's lived with that one before. Just because that person's CEO doesn't mean she should be in charge of everything in our family business. Or I don't have any interest or expertise in the business, but I still want to be involved and contribute. How can I do that? What's my pathway for doing that? And so, again, in that way that you kind of use the 4 rooms is to start to map out what are the roles that you require across them. Do you have leadership within the owner room? Do you have do you have an owner council, or could you serve on it? Could you be the chair? Do you have a board of directors or advisors? And could someone serve in that role or be the leader of it? Management room has all kinds of leadership types of roles. And then the family room also is someone that's organizing the annual family reunion, or that's doing a family history project, or something that is really important to the family, but maybe not so connected to the company itself. And so you can actually use this structure to start to map out what the roles are, and then sort of allows you to have different levels of participation. So people can start to contribute in some places, but not others. It's not just about being in everything or out of everything. And it allows you to have people find their way into a family business in a more nuanced way than either you're working here and doing everything, or you're not and you're all the way outside. And then once you start to look at it through this lens, you start to realize that each of these rooms actually not only requires different leaders necessarily, but different kinds of leaders, right? If you're going back to the example of that person being the CEO deciding everything, well, when you're the CEO of a business, you're used to making decisions for everyone. That's kind of your job, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you want to delegate and empower and so on, but there's decisions to be made and there's a hierarchy and you sit at the top of it. That's not how a board works, right? A board is very much a group of people who are on the same level and working to make decisions together. Just because you're good at one, not only doesn't make you necessarily good at the other, it probably means that you're probably not going to be as good at the other, right? If you're used to a very kind of command and control, decisive leadership, you might not be the greatest board member or board chair, because the leadership role in the board is about building towards consensus, not about being the single decision maker. In the family room, a lot of good leadership there is passion for the family and commitment to the family. It may have absolutely nothing to do with the business, but you're contributing by bringing the family together or by doing some of these things that really help you stay connected, especially as the family starts to grow across the generations. So there's lots of different types of leadership, and the more that we look at it through a broader lens, the more opportunity there is for people to participate in different ways. Bless you. And then as we get into each of those rooms, realizing that we actually might make decisions differently. As I said, the management room is a hierarchy, and you kind of are clear as to who makes the ultimate call. The other rooms tend to be much more by consensus. The family room tends to be by unanimity. Everyone, if we're making a family decision, it might be that everyone has a say in that, and we're going to not do something unless everyone wants to. When we're in the owner room, it actually depends on who has the shares, right? It might be that we all have the same equity value of the company, but I have 51% of the voting shares. Well, at the end of the day, we're equal when we're in the family room, but I get to make the final call. So understanding how decision-making works differently and therefore, stepping into those different roles can be quite helpful. Okay? All right, so that's the idea of opening avenues for multiple forms of leadership. And then lastly, I want to talk about succession in the family business and how we can use some of these concepts as ways to sort of broaden the conversation about succession. So as with the other two, some common things like that person's been designated as the future leader since birth. By the way, that's actually not a great way to choose the leadership of a business, it turns out. There's not a lot of good research on many topics, but there was a group of management professors that studied how different types of companies performed in terms of implementing best practices, in this case in manufacturing. So they studied companies all around the world, companies of different types, private equity run or public or family or private. What they found was it was a nuanced perspective about family businesses. They found on the one hand that family businesses overall are not worse managed, even though we kind of think about them as being not professional. Family businesses are actually not worse managed than other kinds of companies, except when they choose the CEO or senior leader based upon whoever is the eldest son. That's the one exception to that rule, right? So actually not designating the leader at birth is actually a good practice. All right, so then another question that sometimes comes up in the succession conversation, no one wants to work in the business, so we should sell it. I'll talk about, sometimes you can keep the business actually without selling it, even if someone doesn't want to work in it. Or the next generation, they just don't have the stuff. I started this company from nothing, and now the second generation just doesn't have the same drive as I do, and that can also be a trap. And on that last one, there's that very strong, oftentimes, desire to clone, right? To sort of say the next leader has to be just like I was. Just because you're Attila the Hun, Dad, doesn't mean I have to be Attila the Hun. The businesses oftentimes have different needs at different stages, and trying to sort of force someone to say the only way to be successful as a leader in this company is to do it the way that I do it can oftentimes be counterproductive. Okay? So let's talk about a few of these transition issues. I want to first talk about this idea of separating in some ways the transitioning of ownership from the transition of leadership, and then I'll actually talk about the transition of leadership. One of the chapters that was not assigned, you may have read it for extra credit, but I didn't actually assign it, is chapter 3, and we talk about the fact that there are really 4 different types of family businesses out there in the wild. And they really differentiate themselves around these 2 main axes. One is there criteria to be an owner? And what we see in a family business is that sometimes they're inclusive. And by that, family businesses are always exclusive. There's all kinds of people that are not allowed to be owners. But let's imagine within that sort of circle of descendants of the founder, some family businesses are inclusive in the sense that they allow any descendant of the founder to be an owner. Others are exclusive, meaning that you have to not only be born into the family, but contribute to the business, usually by working there in order to be an owner. And some family businesses have those kinds of rules. The other main way in which they differ is how decision-making control is split up between those who are the owners. Some divide it. So if I'm one of 5 and my parents gave us all 20%, then I would have 1/5 of the control. Others will share the equity value, but give a smaller subset actually control over the business. If you kind of put those 2 together, you get these 4 types that I mentioned. Most family businesses, even before they are family businesses, their founder companies start out in that bottom left box, where there's a single person who has all the control. That's the because I said so leader, right? They have all the ownership, all the equity, all the control. As I said, most family businesses start there because there's a single founder, not all, but most. Some of those stay there. So one of the examples we mentioned in the book is a wine business called Marchesi Antinori. They've been around for 26 generations. The first 25 of them, there was a single person who was put in charge of the business. And they followed kind of the primogenitor model. The eldest son kind of got the company. 26th generation, there were 3 daughters. So there was a choice to be made. Do we sell the company? Do we Do we choose one of them, or do we allow all of them to be involved? And actually, the patriarch in the 25th generation decided, let's move over to the right. He still wanted all of his daughters, if they're going to be owners of the business, to work there, and they all do, but can be more than one. And so if you think about another way family businesses are structured is like a law firm or other professional services firm that's a partnership where you have to work there in order to be an owner. And when you stop working there, then usually you have to sell. There's a big European company called CNA. The Brennickmeyer family are the owners of it. They're, I think, going from 5th to 6th generation. They've got 500 owners, 500 family members, only about 50 of which are actually owners of the company. They actually have to demonstrate over a decade their competence to be owners of the business before they're ever allowed to actually buy in to the company. Okay, so some companies are structured that way. Others are kind of, as we typically think about family businesses, up and to the right is the distributed model, which is if I have 5 children, I divide it 20%. They each have the same equity. They each have the same control. And then the last one to the left of that is the concentrated structure. So the idea there is that while anyone might be able to be a descendant, some less than that actually have control. One of the examples we cite in the book is Vitamix, which I'm sure many of you have come across, the high-performance blender company. That's how they work. All of the descendants of the founder are allowed to own shares, but in each generation, the CEO is required to have basically 60% of the voting shares of the company. So their belief is that they try to operate by consensus, but if someone needs to make a decision, that person is given the power to do that. And there are some very sizable family businesses that are kind of built that way. And in fact, all of these, there are very successful companies come in all of these different flavors. Why is this important in this context of succession? Because we really have to, in some ways, separate, when we're thinking about the future of the family business, differentiate between the questions of who owns and who runs, right? And when we're on the bottom row of this chart, the sole owners and partnership, the owners are operators. That's what it means to be an owner, is to be in the business. And some people believe in their company that in order to be an owner, you have to actually be there every day. It's the only way that it can work, and that makes sense in some companies. For the top row, though, the owners don't have to necessarily be working there. They could sit on the board, or they could be shareholders. They don't necessarily have to be actively participating in the company. And that's, I think, the space I just want to make sure that we open up in this conversation about family businesses, is that you don't necessarily have to equate a lack of interest or talent, or maybe both, in the next generation with the need to sell. There are actually some quite successful businesses that are family-owned, board-governed, non-family managed. So I just want to probably open up that broader conversation. That's more on the ownership succession. Now let's talk about succession planning. And thinking about those big decisions when someone's the CEO or president or CFO. How do we think about that succession planning process? Well, one thing I think that we pay not enough attention to in the succession planning process, we tend to think a lot about the person that's coming up through the ranks. We don't tend to think enough about the person that's currently occupying that spot. Because, it's very hard for that person who may have been in that role for 30 years or 40 years, most of their adult life, to just step away and just go off and play golf or something like that. That's not very typical in most cases. I've talked to a lot of folks in that space who even tried that, but it just didn't take. I need to do something important. So actually, part of the succession planning process is, if you're that person, or if you're helping that person, what is that place to land? Where is that person going to go? They're not just going to leave a job where they're at the center of their universe and just go and not do anything. What are they going to go towards, right? Is it playing a more defined role in the company? Is it doing something philanthropically, or working on the next generation? What is the actual place to land, and what's the glide path? What's the way to get from here to there? So an important part of the succession planning process is actually thinking about how do you prepare the current leader to be ready to step away. And then, of course, we have to think about the successors. I thought your table over here, table 4, did a really nice job of not skipping to the end in this process of making people earn it, Having a transparent process, you want to avoid sort of the horse race approach where it's people competing against each other. One thing we did with the family recently was that it was a next generation group of six, actually seven, and the current CEO is slated to retire. He's going to age out in the next year or so. They were really worried that whoever wasn't chosen for that role would leave, and they wanted all of them to stay. They're all good, but they do need to choose someone to be the leader. And so what they did with some help was they didn't start, and they actually said, what's the organizational structure that we need of the future? What does it look like? Is it the same as the one we have right now? Is it different? But they were engaged in this collective process of designing that together. And they said, okay, well, what are the roles? And, what do we need in a president or CEO? Like, is it different than the way that the current person is doing it? So really getting into that collective process. And then by the time it was time to choose, everyone just kind of fell naturally into their place, as opposed to it being a competition and having the person who didn't win it or people didn't win it leave. And then once you've got those things in place, part of good succession planning is really orchestrating the handoff. So remembering that it's a process, not a single event. Oftentimes in succession planning, we get focused on, okay, January 1st, that's when the handover of power comes. And then January 2nd happens and the previous CEO is still sitting in his or her office. People are still coming to that person for decisions, and nothing has really changed, right? And that's just part of the way it goes. It's unlikely to be sort of like a direct handoff in most cases. You want to make sure that you're actually preparing not just the people, but the organization. Most organizations, especially family businesses, are built around people. They reflect that person's individual strengths and weaknesses. When you take someone who has a different mindset and puts them into that business, oftentimes it doesn't work. So I was working with one family business on their transition. The father was the classic entrepreneur, fix everything type of person, very involved in all aspects of the business. And if one of his people was missing a skill set or didn't really have it, he would just do it for him. He would just sort of sub in and sort of fix that problem. Well, his son was a very different mentality. He was more of like someone who liked to develop good process and hire and empower people, let them do their job. And so the organization just was not set up for him to be successful in that role because they had people that were just not quite there in terms of their jobs. And it would have been better for, before that had happened, to go through and say, is this set up for the kind of leader the next generation is going to be? So those are some thoughts about how to do succession and making sure we don't forget the current leader, really helping them to be prepared. There's a whole process of selecting successors and orchestrating the handoff. Again, we can use the 4 rooms. This is a process, not just a single event, a single choice. It's not just holding Simba aloft for everyone to see the next leader of the kingdom. So you can actually use the 4 rooms to help to manage that process. So, in that owner room, that's where you're having conversations about, do we actually want this to be a business we own together as a family? What's the why? Why are we going to do this together? A family, being part of a family business involves sacrifice. You have to be willing to have some uncomfortable conversations with people you're related to. Why do that? What are you getting out of it? And that's one of the important questions in the owner room, is to have that conversation. This is also the place where you're setting policies, things like family employment, so that you're developing good leaders who are actually ready to step into those roles. The board, this is one of the reasons why I was saying why it's so valuable to have a board, is that it has really a critical role in the succession planning process. And if you're going through a succession experience in the next 3 years, 5 years or so, if you don't have a board, this might be a good trigger to get one. The board can help to sort out and say, well, we have two family candidates. Which one do we choose? Much better to have some independent voice and perspective rather than trying to sort that out among their parents, for example. As I mentioned earlier, the board actually can serve also as a backstop. One of the families that we work with is a very successful company, but it's really a lot of it's in the head of the CEO. And there's concern, not just by the family, but also by the suppliers and the customers. If something happened to him, what would happen in the business? And so one of the reasons why he advocated putting a real board into place was that if something happened to him, there'd at least be a group of experienced, knowledgeable enough people to help steward the business until they could find that next successor. The management room, definitely an important role here. That's where you're actually doing the hard work of putting good feedback and mentorship in place. As I mentioned, it's very hard for family members to get real, candid feedback inside their family business. You have to actively create that rather than expecting it to happen. And then you're building your bench strength, both family and non-family people, so that you have leadership to step in down the road. And lastly, there's the role of the family room. As I said, the family room is not about making business decisions. It's about developing talent. And one of the things that's really valuable in the family room is to prepare not just those who will be the future CEO or in those senior roles, but preparing everyone to step into the role of being a good owner. And that involves both some individual skills, like to be a good owner of a company, you don't have to be fluent in financial statements and accounting, but you have to be at least conversant. You have to know a few things. But a lot of this, as I said, this is a team sport. So really learning how to work together and doing that from a young age can be very valuable. So each of these rooms has a very important role to play in managing the complexities of the succession planning process.